Something exploded in Zanjan Province, and the Iranian government called it an accident. That is the official story. An unexploded piece of ordnance, a bomb dropped during the war that somehow failed to detonate, sitting quietly in the ground until someone disturbed it, until 14 Revolutionary Guard members were in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and the story ended for all of them simultaneously. Clean explanation, simple narrative. The kind of statement a regime releases when it needs the public to stop asking questions before the questions start forming. And in a country where the internet has been cut for more than 2 months, where the flow of information is controlled with the same institutional discipline that the IRGC applies to everything else it controls, that explanation might have worked. It might have landed and stayed and become the version of events that history recorded. Except the IRGC has been having a great number of accidents lately. Stay with me. Because by the end of this, you will understand something that the coverage of the Zanjan explosion, the coverage that accepted the official explanation and moved on within the same news cycle, is entirely missing. Not just about 14 dead Revolutionary Guard members in a province that most people cannot locate on a map, but about what those 14 deaths, layered against everything else happening simultaneously inside Iran right now, reveal about the actual internal condition of a regime that is performing stability for an audience. It is cut off from the ability to verify anything. The picture that emerges when you put all of it together is not the picture of a government managing a crisis. It is the picture of a government that has lost control of the crisis and is now managing the story about the crisis instead. And those are two completely different things with two completely different trajectories. Let us start with Zanjan, because the details of this incident are where the official explanation begins to develop the kind of structural problems that official explanations develop when they are constructed to conceal rather than to inform. 14 IRGC members killed in a single incident, described as unexploded ordnance, a remnant of the American or Israeli strike packages from the opening phase of the conflict that somehow failed to detonate on impact and waited dormant until a group of Revolutionary Guards encountered it. Under circumstances the official statement does not specify with any precision. This explanation is not impossible. Unexploded ordnance is a documented phenomenon of every modern military conflict. Munitions fail, fuses malfunction. Weapons designed to explode on contact sometimes don't, and they remain in the ground or in structures as latent hazards that claim lives weeks or months after the strike that delivered them. This happens. It is real. It is documented across every theater where modern weapons have been employed in concentrated strike packages. But here is what the official explanation requires you to not look at too carefully. The pattern, the frequency, the consistency with which IRGC personnel have been dying in circumstances that the regime is characterizing as accidents, misfires, ordnance failures, and operational mishaps since the ceasefire took effect. 14 in Zanjan, others before. A pattern of mysterious deaths accumulating in an environment where the regime has simultaneously cut the population off from the internet that would allow anyone outside the official information architecture to independently verify, corroborate, or challenge any of these explanations. The shutdown of internet access inside Iran is not incidental to the question of what is killing IRGC members. It is structurally connected to it, because the same information blackout that prevents Iranian civilians from organizing and communicating also prevents the independent verification of every event the regime chooses to characterize as an accident. When a government controls the information environment completely, the death toll among its own military personnel keeps climbing in ways that do not fit the operational profile of unexploded ordnance recovery operations. The professional analytical question is not whether the official explanation is technically possible. It is whether the pattern of events is consistent with the explanation being offered, or whether it is consistent with something else entirely. Something else is consistent with this pattern, and that something else has a name, a history, and a doctrine. The Israeli defense minister did not make his statement accidentally. Senior figures in governments at war do not appear publicly and state that we may soon be required to take action again in Iran to ensure the regime cannot threaten Israel for years to come without that statement serving a purpose. That purpose might be diplomatic signaling, it might be domestic political communication, it might be a deliberate message to specific audiences inside Iran about the consequences of specific decisions, or it might be something considerably more direct, a statement made in the knowledge that actions already underway will soon produce visible results, and that establishing a public record of intent before those results become visible serves the operational purpose of making attribution simultaneously obvious and deniable. Israel has practiced that particular communications discipline for decades. It is not a new capability. The Zanjan explosion is the most lethal incident since the ceasefire began on April 7th. 14 confirmed dead, more injured, receiving treatment, their condition unknown. And the reason those numbers are hard to verify The reason the full picture of what happened in that province is inaccessible to independent analysis is not a technical limitation. It is a policy decision. Iran has maintained a near-total internet blackout for more than 2 months. The information architecture inside the country has been reduced to what the regime chooses to release, filtered through state media that operates under the direct supervision of the same institutions whose personnel are dying in what the official statements call accidents. And this is where the story moves from a single explosion in a province most people cannot name to something that illuminates the entire internal architecture of a regime under maximum pressure. An Iranian lawmaker named Sabeti said it publicly. He said it on the record. He did not bury it in bureaucratic language or dress it up in ideological framing that softens what he was actually communicating. He said that authorities are keeping international internet access restricted because of fears it could be used to organize unrest. He referenced the national uprising of January 8th and 9th directly, the uprising during which security forces killed thousands of protesters in the streets of Iranian cities, and said that similar events could happen again if restrictions are lifted. He said the shutdown was ordered by the Supreme National Security Council and would remain in place as long as war conditions persist. Read that statement and sit with what it actually contains. A sitting Iranian lawmaker, speaking publicly, has confirmed 3 things simultaneously. First, that the regime's primary motivation for the internet shutdown is not information security in the military sense. It is the prevention of civilian organizing. The regime is more afraid of its own people coordinating protest than it is of American intelligence services gathering signal. Second, that the events of January, the killing of thousands of protesters in the streets, are understood by the regime itself as a baseline for what could happen again. Not a historical anomaly, but a live possibility that the current information architecture is specifically designed to prevent from recurring. Third, that the war conditions framing is the legal and institutional justification for maintaining a domestic control mechanism that the regime cannot remove without immediately facing the mass civilian response it is suppressing. This is not analysis of the regime's internal psychology. This is the regime's internal psychology stated plainly in public by a figure who said the quiet part out loud because the regime's paranoia has reached a level where the officials are no longer carefully controlling what they admit. The economy is collapsing because of the internet shutdown. That is not a secondary effect. It is a structural consequence of cutting a modern economy off from the digital infrastructure that virtually every sector, banking, commerce, supply chain coordination, international trade, professional services, depends on to function. The regime knows this. Its officials know this. The calculation being made, explicitly and without apparent embarrassment, is that economic collapse is an acceptable cost if the alternative is an internet-connected population that can organize itself politically. That calculation tells you everything about how the regime reads the threat environment it is operating in. It is more afraid of its own people with smartphones than it is of the consequences of economic disintegration. That is not a government that believes it has popular legitimacy. That is a government that knows it does not. Now let us go deeper, because the internet shutdown and the Zanjan explosion are the visible surfaces of a pattern that goes considerably further underground. Hamid Aladdin is a father of 2. He was arrested for using Starlink. He was not provided evidence of the accusation. He was not given an opportunity to defend himself. He never appeared before a court. He was beaten in a detention facility, and he died from that beating. His body was then confiscated by the state and held, not returned to his family, released for burial, until his family agreed to sign a contract committing them to silence. No public statements about what happened. No disclosure of the circumstances of his death. Silence, purchased with the body of a man who was killed for connecting to the internet as the price of receiving that body back for burial. This is happening inside Iran right now, not as an aberration, not as an excess committed by a rogue unit that the institutional system would correct if it knew, as policy. As the institutional response of a security apparatus so paranoid about the information environment that it is killing people for accessing it and then confiscating the evidence of the killing until the families agree to become instruments of the concealment. Starlink was banned on February 28th, the day the war began. The ban exists because satellite internet bypasses the terrestrial infrastructure that the regime controls and shuts down. It exists because a population with Starlink access is a population the regime cannot silence by flipping a switch. And the enforcement of that ban, the active, lethal confession extraction enforcement of it, tells you that the regime understands with complete clarity what an informed, connected, coordinating Iranian population represents to its continued existence. The Chief Justice of Iran appeared on live television and said it with the flat, procedural affect of someone announcing administrative policy rather than describing the planned killing of human beings. Those who have committed crimes, those who collaborated with the enemy, those who acted as agents within and outside the country, They will be pursued, identified, tried promptly, and executed. He said the judiciary will not be deterred by the objections of arrogant powers who think they can tell Iran not to execute people. He said the cases will be handled quickly and accurately, and the sentences will be implemented. He said this on live television about protesters, about people who were in the streets of Iranian cities in January. This is the institutional response of a government that has made a calculation about which threat is more immediate, the American military or the Iranian public. The executions are continuing. The number of people killed during the January protests keeps growing as the judicial process, the Chief Justice described, accelerates its tempo. The regime is not managing the population. It is trying to eliminate the segment of it that demonstrated the willingness to resist. And it is doing this simultaneously with the management of a ceasefire, a failing nuclear negotiation, a fractured internal command structure, a blockade that is strangling its revenue, and a pattern of military personnel deaths in circumstances it is describing as accidents. This is not a government under pressure. This is a government in the process of consuming itself. Now let us talk about the negotiation, because this is where the international picture connects to the internal one in ways that make both more comprehensible and more alarming. President Trump stood on the South Lawn and described what is happening inside the Iranian leadership with a directness that the diplomatic community's language never manages to achieve. Disjointed, very argumentative with each other, confused. One group wants one thing, another group wants something different. The hardliners want to make a deal, but the terms they can accept are not the terms the United States is demanding. And in the gaps between what the different Iranian factions can accept individually and what they can present collectively as a negotiating position, the proposal that arrived through Pakistani intermediaries, a document of 14 points representing the distilled output of a fractured, resource-depleted, internally warring institutional structure trying to agree on something to offer. That document was rejected, not deferred, not returned for revision with specific guidance. Rejected, unacceptable, not what the United States needs to see. And then, in the same conversation, the president confirmed that the CENTCOM commander had briefed him on military options and described those options with a clarity that no diplomatic packaging was applied to. Blast them and finish them forever, or make a deal. Those are the options as he described them, and he said he preferred not to blast them on a human basis. But he said it as a preference, not as a constraint. The negotiation is centered on a specific and revealing fault line. The United States wants the nuclear program addressed in the agreement. The Iranians have been trying to limit the agreement to the Strait of Hormuz, the maritime issue, the blockade issue, the immediate economic survival issue, and exclude the nuclear question from the framework. White House envoy Steve Witkoff delivered American amendments that reinserted the nuclear provisions into the draft agreement. The Iranian response went further toward the American position than any previous proposal had, but not far enough. And that gap, the distance between further than before and far enough, is the gap that is now being measured against the military options that were laid out in a top-secret meeting the media knew was happening but could not attend. The nuclear question is not a procedural dispute about which items belong in which section of a diplomatic document. It is the foundational question of what this entire crisis is actually about. The blockade, the strikes, the economic pressure, the proxy network dismantlement, all of it is tactical context for a single strategic objective: the elimination of Iran's nuclear weapons pathway, not its delay, not its limitation to a breakout timeline that can be monitored and managed, its elimination. And the Iranian regime's attempt to negotiate an agreement that addresses the Strait of Hormuz without addressing the nuclear program is the attempt of an institution that understands it can survive economic pressure and even military degradation as long as the nuclear program survives. Because the nuclear program is the ultimate insurance policy, the deterrent that no conventional military campaign can fully eliminate once it crosses the threshold that matters. Iran is not negotiating to end the crisis. It is negotiating to protect the one asset that makes the crisis survivable on terms the regime can still function within. Trump's rejection is the rejection of that strategy. It is the statement that the United States will not separate the Hormuz question from the nuclear question, will not accept a deal that resolves the immediate economic and maritime crisis while leaving this fundamental strategic threat intact, and will maintain the full weight of military presence and economic pressure until the nuclear program is on the table in a way that produces the outcome Washington has defined as necessary. The IRGC knows what that means, which is why the military commanders are making public statements about renewed conflict being likely, which is why the hardened facilities are being filled with whatever surviving missile stockpile can be reallocated before the next phase begins, which is why the internet stays off and the executions continue and the bodies of people killed for using Starlink are held by the state until their families agree to disappear into silence. The regime is preparing for two scenarios simultaneously, and the preparation for each one contradicts the preparation for the other. The diplomatic track requires presenting a coherent negotiating position, which requires institutional coordination across factions that are actively fighting each other for dominance in the post-crisis structure, which requires the political class, the foreign minister, the president, the figures whose job is external-facing communication, to be empowered to make concessions. The military track requires protecting capability, hardening positions, dispersing surviving assets, and projecting resolve, which requires the IRGC command structure to prioritize its own institutional survival over the diplomatic process. These two preparations cannot coexist cleanly in the same institutional structure. They produce the confusion that Trump described, the disjointedness, the contradictory signals, one group saying one thing, another saying another. Not because the Iranian leadership is irrational, because it is comprised of competing institutions with competing survival calculations, trying to operate as a unified government under conditions that have made unified governance essentially impossible. And into that internal fracture, into the space between the factions, into the gap between the political class that needs a deal and the military class that needs to not surrender, the intelligence community operates. The CIA, the Mossad, organizations that have spent decades learning the architecture of this regime's internal dynamics, mapping the personal relationships, the factional loyalties, the individual calculations that each significant figure inside the system is making about their own future. That work does not pause because a ceasefire is in effect. The ceasefire is not a pause in the intelligence operation. For certain kinds of intelligence activity, it is the optimal operating environment. The regime's security apparatus is stretched between managing the external negotiation, suppressing the internal population, executing the protesters, hiding the missiles, and investigating what happened to 14 of its members in Zanjan. In that environment, the seams between factions are wider, the institutional coordination is thinner, and the individual figures inside the system who are making personal survival calculations are more accessible to the kind of contact that changes outcomes without leaving fingerprints. The explosion in Zanjan may have been an accident. The unexploded ordnance explanation is technically possible, marginally consistent with the post-strike environment, and conveniently unverifiable in an information blackout. Or it may be the 14th in a pattern of deaths that is not random, not accidental, and not stopping. The regime's characterization of what is happening is the only characterization that exists inside Iran, because the internet is off, because independent journalists cannot operate, because the families of the dead have been required to sign silence agreements as the price of receiving their dead. Outside the country, the pattern is visible, the frequency is visible. The regime's extraordinary paranoia about its own population, visible in the internet shutdown, the Starlink executions, the accelerated judicial processing of protesters, the public statements of officials who are more afraid of their own citizens than of the American military, all of it is visible. What is not visible is the precise mechanism, and the precise mechanism is the question that should be occupying every intelligence analyst who is paying attention to the gap between the official explanation and the operational reality of an organization that has been making precisely calculated decisions about when and how to apply precisely calibrated pressure for longer than most of the IRGC commanders currently alive have been in uniform. The regime's paranoia is producing its own acceleration. Every action it takes to suppress the information environment, the shutdown, the arrests, the executions, the body confiscations, the silence agreements, every one of those actions generates more internal pressure than it releases. The Iranian population is not less aware of what is happening because the internet is off. It is more aware in the specific and intimate way that people become aware of things when the only information they receive comes from their immediate physical environment. Their neighborhood, their workplace, the family members who have not been heard from, the colleagues who did not come back, the economy that is visibly deteriorating in every transaction, every shortage, every price that is higher than it was yesterday. Information suppression in a modern society does not create ignorance. It creates a specific kind of knowledge, direct, personal, embodied, and impossible to dismiss as propaganda or misinformation, that produces the social conditions the regime is most afraid of. The lawmaker said it. If we reopen the internet, we could see protests like January. He said that because the conditions for protests like January already exist without the internet would not create the anger, it would coordinate it. This is the tectonic pressure that the regime is sitting on top of while it manages the ceasefire and the negotiation and the internal faction war and the IRGC deaths in Zanjan and the execution of protesters and the imprisonment of fathers of two for connecting to a satellite. Not a single one of these crises can be resolved without making another one worse. Reopen the internet to allow economic activity to resume and risk the popular organizing that could produce an uprising. Keep it closed and watch the economy deteriorate to a point where the uprising happens anyway, without coordination, spontaneously, because hunger and desperation are their own organizing principle. Execute the protesters to signal that resistance has consequences, and produce exactly the kind of documented atrocity that, when the information blackout eventually ends, will be the archive from which the accountability narrative is built. Stop executing them and signal that the cost of resistance is survivable. Negotiate on nuclear issues and lose the one asset the regime believes guarantees its long-term survival. Refuse to negotiate on nuclear issues and watch the military options meeting at the White House translate into a decision that the CENTCOM commander is already prepared to execute. Every exit is blocked. Every door leads to a worse room. The regime knows this. Its officials, even the ones speaking publicly with the practiced confidence of institutional authority, are saying things that only make sense if they know this. The Chief Justice is accelerating executions. The lawmakers are explaining the internet shutdown in terms that reveal the fear underneath the policy. The military commanders are making statements about renewed conflict that serve their factional interests, regardless of whether those interests align with the regime's survival. And 14 bodies in Zanjan are being described as an accident by a state media apparatus that is the only information source available to the population they are describing it to. Trump's statement from the South Lawn is the clearest available window into how Washington reads this picture. They have no Navy. They have no Air Force. They have no anti-aircraft. They have no nothing. He said that. And then he said he preferred not to blast them on a human basis, but that blasting them was the option being evaluated. The preference is stated as a preference, not as a decision. The CENTCOM options briefing happened. The military presence in the theater has not decreased. Supply aircraft have been observed, increasing their flight tempo into American bases across the region. The war powers clock has been reset through the formal notification to Congress that active hostilities have terminated. The legal architecture is clean. The operational preparation is ongoing. The gap between the American negotiating position and the Iranian counterproposal remains, and the president has stated he is not satisfied with what has been offered. The 14-point proposal was not accepted. The follow-on proposal, the Iranian counter to the American amendments, went further than before, but not far enough. The nuclear question remains the dividing line. And on the other side of that dividing line, 14 IRGC members are dead in Zanjan in circumstances the regime is calling an accident. A man is dead in a detention facility for using satellite internet. The Chief Justice is promising to keep executing protesters. A lawmaker has publicly confirmed that the internet shutdown exists to prevent an uprising, and the factions inside the IRGC are fighting over what is left of the institutional structure in a resource environment that cannot satisfy any of them. The ceasefire is holding in the narrow technical sense that no airstrikes have been launched in the weeks since April 7th. In every other sense, the economic pressure of the blockade, the intelligence operations, whose results may include the bodies in Zanjan, the judicial executions of protesters, the internal faction warfare, the population under-information blackout that the regime's own officials admit could rise if the blackout is lifted. In every other sense, the pressure has not paused. It has compounded. It is layered. It has continued to compress the space available to the regime in ways that make each passing week not a week of breathing room, but a week of accumulating internal stress that has nowhere to go because every release valve has been sealed. The next development is not predictable in its specific form. It is predictable in its structural logic. The gap between what Iran can offer on the nuclear question and what America will accept is not closing at a pace that the economic and political timelines permit to remain open indefinitely. The IRGC's hardline commanders have stated publicly that renewed conflict is likely. The regime's internal fractures are deepening as resources contract. The population is sitting on anger that the information blackout is containing but not eliminating. The intelligence operations that may or may not be responsible for deaths in Zanjan are not pausing because diplomatic communication is ongoing, and the CENTCOM commander has already delivered his options to the President of the United States. What remains unknown is the sequence. Which breaks first? Whether the internal Iranian structure fractures along factional lines before the external pressure from a renewed military operation adds to the load. Whether the population's accumulated anger produces the organizing that the regime is suppressing, triggered not by a restored internet, but by something more basic, a shortage, a salary that does not arrive, a death that becomes the story everyone knows without needing a network to spread it. Whether the intelligence operations accumulate to a point where the regime's internal security apparatus cannot contain what it cannot explain as accident. Whether the negotiation produces a breakthrough that changes the trajectory of all of it, or collapses in a way that removes the last institutional argument against the military option being evaluated in rooms the public never sees. Nobody inside the Iranian regime can answer that sequence. Not the faction that wants to make a deal. Not the faction that wants to fight. Not the Chief Justice who is executing protesters on live television. Not the lawmaker who accidentally told the world that his government is afraid of its own people. And not the officials managing the investigation into what happened in Zanjan, in a province where 14 Revolutionary Guard members died. And the explanation that has been offered is one that the pattern of recent events makes very difficult to accept at face value. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the Zanjan explosion is what the Iranian government says it is? Or does the pattern of the last several weeks tell a different story? Subscribe to World Brief Live right now and turn on notifications. Because the next development in this negotiation, the moment when the gap between what Iran can offer and what America will accept finally forces the decision that has been building in the rooms that the public never hears about, that is the story that makes everything we have laid out today the context for something considerably larger. The internet is off inside Iran. The executions are accelerating. The bodies are being held until the families agree to silence. And in Zanjan, 14 men are dead in circumstances that the regime needs you to stop thinking about. This is World Brief Live. Stay informed, stay ahead. The ceasefire is a name. What is happening underneath it is something else entirely.